think it's 8:01. We are going to start. Again, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining the Arizona Capital Times Morning Scoop. My name is Luige Del Puerto. I'm the associate publisher and editor of the Arizona Capital Times. If you don't have a Capital Times subscription, please let me know and I'll get you squared away. We are tackling a very big subject this morning. I surveyed several articles last night on the subject of learning loss, and it's pretty grim. They all warn of the all site studies warning of learning loss as a result of the disruption that we're seeing in the schools, particularly the shutdown we experienced a couple months ago. And some of these studies are saying perhaps some students are losing even one full school year's worth of learning. But before that, I want to thank our sponsor this morning for engaging with us this way. Our discussion is sponsored by the Center for the Future of Arizona. The center brings together Arizonans to build a bright future for our state by advancing the priorities that Arizonans say matter most to them and to their future. The well-being of our children, specifically the education of our children, is a key focus of the center. Indeed, the center has launched several initiatives in this area, including Arizona Pathways to Prosperity, where the center works with industry and education leaders to create a system of early college career pathways to enable more young people to earn degrees and credentials. And including Beat the Odds School Leadership Academy, which in partnership with the National Institute for School Leadership, the center works with traditional public school districts and charter schools to provide executive leadership training to current and aspiring principals across the state. To tell us more, please welcome Dr. Sybil Francis, a founding member and president and CEO of the Center for the Future of Arizona. Dr. Francis?
Good morning, Luigi. Thank you so much. We are so thrilled to be partnered with you and a sponsor of a number of these events. And I just want to also congratulate you for really the wonderful service that you are doing for our community and for our leaders in bringing so many important issues to our audience. We were thrilled in the past to have sponsored one of your discussions on youth and mental health. Another one was on the digital divide between those who have access to the internet and those who don't, particularly in the rural areas. So we're really thrilled to be partners with you in this. I'd like to thank all the panelists for being with us this morning. It happens to be that all of these folks this morning are ones that we have worked with on some of our education initiatives. So we're absolutely thrilled to do that. As you mentioned so eloquently, the Center for the Future of Arizona brings Arizonans together to create a stronger and brighter future for our state. We do that in a number of ways. We listen very closely to Arizonans to learn what matters most to them. We share trusted data about how Arizona is doing in those areas. We bring critical issues to public attention. What we're doing this morning would be one of those times. And we work with communities and leaders across the state to solve public problems. We believe that the voices of Arizonans are more important than ever, which is one of the reasons that we are renewing our partnership with the Gallup organization to do a scientifically based statewide really unique poll of Arizonans across every major policy issue and public policy issue across the state, which we'll be releasing this April. We, over our 18-year history, have tackled large and very complex issues that are important to Arizona's future, including education, workforce development, and civic engagement. And certainly the topic this morning is of really critical importance and interest to us, with something we've been thinking about for a long time. And the punchline is learning loss is not new, and there are strategies to deal with it. And so with that, I will just thank you and thank the panelists again and turn it back to you.
Thank you, Dr. Francis. I forgot to note, of course, that Dr. Francis, for more than 3 decades, has been a dedicated public policy architect who is very committed to advancing innovative solutions to social imperatives. So thank you again, Dr. Francis.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much.
We have a really powerhouse panel this morning, and let me just introduce each of them. Joining us is Kathy Hoffman, who is the State Superintendent of Public Instruction. Superintendent Hoffman was elected to the office 2 years ago after spending her career, or pretty much her entire career, working in public education, first as a preschool teacher and then as a speech language pathologist. She started out in the Vail School District in Southern Arizona before joining the Peoria School District. As the state's top education official during this very tumultuous time, she has worked to transition more than 1 million students out of the classroom and into remote or distance learning. She has hunkered down to craft guidelines to help schools manage the pandemic, and her collaboration with Governor Doug Ducey and other state officials helped to secure hundreds of millions of dollars in funding and other resources for schools. And of course, the work is far from over. Superintendent Hoffman, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Also with us is Representative Reginald Boulding, who represents Legislative District 28. Representative Boulding serves on several committees, notably as a ranking member of the House Education Committee. He also serves as the House Minority Whip. His work in the legislature focuses on education, economic development, criminal justice, and veterans and civil rights. A first-generation college student, Representative Boulding graduated at the top of his class from the University of Cincinnati, where he earned an undergraduate degree in criminal justice and international security. He turned down a full-ride law school scholarship to become a special education teacher in South Phoenix. And in 2010, he started a nonprofit organization to provide students from low-income communities access to internships and workforce development training at top companies and organizations in our state. Currently, he runs a civic engagement organization, Arizona Coalition for Change, which empowers everyday citizens to grow their civic and political power to change their communities for the better. Representative Boulding, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Also joining us is Carla Phillips, and I hope I'm pronouncing her last name correctly. Krivickas, is that correct? Did I get that one down? Awesome, perfect. Carla is the Senior Director of Policy at KnowledgeWorks. As a Senior Director of Policy, she leads the development and execution of KnowledgeWorks state policy strategy, partnering with states to transform their policy systems to support personalized learning. She's a seasoned veteran in this work, previously serving as policy director for the Foundation for Excellence in Education, where she built the organization's next generation learning portfolio. She has also served as a special assistant to the Deputy Superintendent at the Arizona Department of Education, as the governor's education policy advisor, and as the vice chair of the Developmental Disabilities Planning Council. She began her career in education, serving for 7 years as a senior policy advisor for the Arizona House of Representatives. Carla, thank you for joining us.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
We have also joining us is Dr. Andi Fourlis, who is the superintendent of Mesa Public Schools. She had cut her teeth on education in 1992 as a teacher in the Washington Elementary School District in Phoenix. She then joined the Scottsdale Unified School District in 1996, where she spent 19 years as a teacher, director, executive director, and assistant superintendent. In 2015, she joined the Arizona Science Center as its chief learning officer, and 3 years ago, she moved to the Mesa Public Schools as first assistant superintendent of teaching and learning. She also served as a deputy superintendent, also in the school district. Throughout her 24-year career, Dr. Fourlis uses strategic thinking to ignite meaningful learning for students and adults. Andi, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. It's an honor.
And finally, we have Dr. Amanda Burke, who is the Managing Director of Strategic Initiatives and Impact at the Center for the Future of Arizona. She joined the center in 2009. She focuses on innovation and systemic change that will advance the priorities of Arizonans and serve and secure the long-term future success of our state. She oversees the center's strategic initiatives in the area of education, workforce, and civic health. Dr. Burke earlier served as the CFA's Senior Director, Education and Workforce. And previously, she was the Director of Education, Innovation, and Policy at Arizona State University in the Office of University Initiatives within the Office of the President. Dr. Burke is also a Teach for America alumna. Dr. Burke, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Let me see. So, as I mentioned earlier, this is a difficult subject and something that our school leaders are grappling with, which is learning loss. As I mentioned also, I've read several articles about where we're at, and they all kind of say the same thing, which is we're there is a learning gap, there is a learning loss, and depending on the kind and quality of education that's being delivered online, we could be looking at between 50% to maybe even 100% or a full year or something like that. In fact, before that, I want to ask Superintendent Hoffman, ma'am, where are we in terms of schools opening in person right now? What is the scenario? What is the overall environment?
As of last Thursday, the Department of Health Services updated their website to show that now 14 out of the 15 counties have met the public health benchmarks for hybrid or in-person learning. The majority are still in that yellow, moderate, hybrid range where where the recommendation is to have a reduced number of students in the classroom and then other students learning from home through online learning or through distance learning. So it is still quite varied across the state, and we also need to continue to be vigilant because we are starting to see the numbers tick up a little bit in some of the counties.
Thank you for that update. I want to ask Superintendent Andi Fourlis from Mesa Public Schools. Ma'am, what is happening in your school district at this point? Are the students back in the classroom?
So as of September 14th, we began 2 days of modified in-person instruction. So students are in 2 different groups. They attend school 2 days per week. Wednesday is a day off. We have been tracking our public health metrics diligently, and we will be opening to in-person 5 days a week modified in-person learning on October 12th if our public health metrics continue to point us in that right direction. So we need 2 weeks of very strong data, and that will lead us to 5 days of modified in-person, which means that we're still offering distance learning as well as in-person learning and adhering to all safety protocols, including masks and hygiene processes and so on.
So how many students do you anticipate are going to be physically in person at your schools?
So Mesa Public Schools, we're the largest school district in the state of Arizona. We have approximately 60,000 children, and we will have about 60% of those in our classrooms and about the remaining 40% learning in a distance learning fashion. And because we are so large, that looks different at every school. So some schools, 90% of the kids have chosen to come back to modified in person, and at other schools, as low as 37%.
All right, so let's tackle learning loss. As I mentioned, there's the fear that maybe our students are there's a learning gap. There's a concept of a potential setback for them because they're stuck at home and it's just not the same as in-person instruction. Let me ask Carla. Carla, when you hear learning loss, what comes to your mind? And is this what you're hearing as well and seeing as well on the ground in Arizona?
Absolutely. We're hearing that nationwide as well as here at home in Arizona. But when I think of learning loss, I think that that term is constraining us to a model that thinks about kids at a certain age in a certain grade having to finish by a certain time. And I think that model hasn't been working well. I think COVID-19 has exposed the one-size-fits-all model. So we're really hoping to partner with states to try to figure out how we can build more resilient and flexible systems that can maximize time.
And Representative Bolding, I guess the same question to you, sir. When you hear learning loss, you've been working in education arena for a number of years. What comes to your mind, and what do you think of the framing of it, which is our students are not getting what they used to be getting?
Yeah, the biggest thing that I'm really concerned about, in addition to everything when we talk about learning loss, is those students that may not have a safe work environment to actually access content. So while we know that there's options, whether there's in person or there's these options that are satellite, in some scenarios, if you don't have the ability to really work in a safe space where you can actually dive in and tackle the material, you are going to be at a position in which you're going to not be able to comprehend the information that you need. And I think, to Carla's point, this idea that your age determines what grade level that you should be in, and then the content that you should access is one that we have to really take a step back and look, because the reality is there are students that are currently in the system that can access higher content that's at a higher grade than they should be in, and vice versa. Those students who need more remediation, more support. So I think this is an opportunity for us to really step back, really and visualize what do we believe that education should be, and then begin to tackle that. That way we can measure our students in a way that's going to provide them with an opportunity to be successful.
And Amanda, you know, I think all of us saw how COVID-19 has magnified the problems that we have been kind of laboring under for decades in our education system. You know, from your end, what are some of those systemic issues that you are seeing being magnified, being exacerbated by COVID-19? And you know, we've had a couple of months to learn and kind of adapt. What are you seeing in terms of solutions offered by the schools, and maybe solutions that schools are considering, or solutions that you in the center think would be really good strategies to not just resolve, but deal with these you know, problems on kind of a permanent basis?
Thank you so much for asking that, Luigi. Well, as both Carla and Representative Boulding have said, these are not new issues. CFA is data-based. We can look at the education progress meter and see that for many of our children, we have not had equitable learning outcomes for a long time for kids. You know, just to give a couple examples, you can look at third grade reading in our state, and for our Latino children, 36% are proficient. For our children who have come from families that may have low incomes, 34%. For our children that have learning disabilities, 18%. And that's just proficient. So when you think about how critical reading is to a child's future, we know we've had work to do for a long time. Some of the other challenges that have really been brought into focus during COVID include not all kids have access to the internet or the technology that they need within their home. As Representative Boulding said, we know well-being for children and for their families matters. That's coming right into focus. And so is the fact that kids learn in different ways, at different times, at different paces. Kids come to us in school with different levels of readiness. And the reality is that we've never had in our country an education system that is designed truly around the student to meet that learner where they are, help support them to high levels of mastery, and importantly, grow their own agency and ownership in their own learning. And that's a lot of the work that we're doing at CFA. We've been working with schools for many years that want to move towards more student-centered learning models. It's important that we have policy that helps support this, and we have to support practitioners. We have to support school leaders and teachers with the skills and the strategies to be able to make these shifts. And I'm really proud to say that the Center for the Future of Arizona is working with a number of districts, including Mesa Public Schools, to do just that.
Andi, I want to ask you about the fact that students, our pupils, have not had a chance to really socialize with other kids at a school setting since, I guess, since March, right? And I know that studies have shown that unstructured play, for example, is really beneficial to children. The fact that they haven't had this opportunity to kind of socialize and do unstructured play and just be in the playground and develop their you know, emotional, mental resiliency that way. Can you talk a little bit about what this means for students?
Thank you, Luigi. I think that when we ask ourselves, what is the purpose of school? My answer would have been very different prior to COVID. I have a heightened sense of awareness about the purpose of school today, and that is about the socialization of our children, as you're talking about, but it's also about the socialization and the support systems that we have for our families. That schools are learning institutions, and we need to be able to, we need to think very deeply about learning what. And so when we talk about this idea of children being behind, they're behind in what? Are they behind in social skills? Are they behind in the behavioral skills, academic skills? Because all of those work so closely together. I've got kind of a funny story that when we opened up to 2 days of modified in-person, September 14th, we were very diligent about learning spaces for children, how we were going to physically distance and make sure that kids were able to be in a classroom, but safely distanced from one another. We closed down our playgrounds. That was a really bad idea in many communities. Kids came back to school and they looked at the playground and it was off limits. Well, that took us a week to get our act together to say, we're going to open up those playgrounds, because there's a lot of social skills that happen and a lot of socialization and how we negotiate and work through resiliency. You know, we have amazing, very creative staff that have figured out the upslide and the downslide. I mean, we've got lots of different things that are happening, but that's just a very small story to talk about that purpose of socialization. And we've got to think about what does that look like in an academic sense, but then also meeting those social emotional needs that our kids desperately need to exercise those skills as we welcome them back to school.
Yeah, I remember in one of our morning scoops, Superintendent Gabriel Trujillo in Tucson talked about how they structured their reading program so that it's very collaborative. You're in a classroom and you're helping each other out. And back then it was early on, maybe March or May, he was saying, well, we don't quite know how to deal with our reading program now, that, you know, we have to make sure that students and teachers practice social distancing in the classroom. And so what does that do to our program? I wonder if you run into the same kinds of issues in your school, in your schools, Dr. Fourlis.
Yes, absolutely. So we know that in Mesa Public Schools, we are anchored to our promise to our community, that we know our kids by name, serve them by strength and need, so they're ready for college, career, and community. So we have to ask ourselves, what does that look like in the world of COVID? And then we have developed a portrait of a Mesa Public School graduate, and it is centered around essential attitudes of resiliency, of it being inclusive, being ethical, and then very strong essential skills such as collaboration and communication. So what does that look like in a socially distanced classroom? We have very creative teachers that have done a lot of work creating flexible learning spaces, flexible seating, so that kids can interact well. So now we're kind of undoing and rethinking what does that look like. There's some pretty amazing strategies that are happening. Kids are working as they call their zombie arms, 6 feet apart, and connecting to one another differently. So there is no shortage of creativity that is happening to work around. And so what we're learning is you don't have to be shoulder to shoulder to be a reading partner. What could it look like to be a reading partner 4 feet away? And managing that distance and understanding, most importantly, the why behind the distance. And there's a lot of learning that is happening that I never thought we would be having conversation about. Why am I 4 feet away from my friend or 6 feet away from my friend? That's new, incredibly relevant learning that is happening in our classrooms throughout Mesa Public Schools today.
And I want to pause here for a second and ask our audience, if you have questions to any one of our panel members, please do send in your questions. We'll try and tackle as many of them toward the end of the program. So just send in your questions via the chat room or via the Q&A room. I want to go to Superintendent Hoffman. We've had a couple months of this, I guess you can call it experiment, right? And now we're back to school. I wonder, we had several very big problems at the very start, like access to computers, access to Wi-Fi, technical support for families, etc. Are we more confident this time around in terms of our ability to deliver and teach our kids? Where are we at in terms of those problems that we were trying to figure out very quickly in the beginning of the year?
In terms of teaching and learning in an online environment, we have made significant gains since March. I know since COVID first hit that our teachers and educators have been learning new systems and technologies to deliver that instruction. and our students and families have been learning. And then also a lot of our districts and schools have used their CARES Act funding or other sources to purchase more laptops and hotspots and deliver the technology to help students connect from home. But that said, I've continued to meet with district and superintendents from across the state, and in particular in some of our rural communities. I was just speaking with a group of superintendents in Mojave County, and they do not have adequate broadband internet access in their communities, and hotspots do not work because they also do not have adequate cell service or cell towers that is needed to use the hotspots. And so they were asking, this was actually one of their highest priorities, asking me, when is the state going to help us get broadband high-speed internet to our communities so that our students can have online learning? And so this is still a significant, severe issue, especially in our rural communities across the state. But I have been very impressed with the innovative solutions, and like we were talking about before, our teachers going above and beyond to be creative and innovative and doing everything they can to reach their students. But this digital divide issue is absolutely contributing, one of the biggest contributors to why we are going to see significant inequities in learning during this period.
And I'm going to ask all of you in a little bit about what are you seeing in terms of innovations from the schools to tackle and address and really overcome these potential gaps that we're seeing. But I want to go to Representative Bolding. Sir, you have school-age children, right?
I have a 4-year-old, so preschool.
Preschool, okay. Well, in terms of what you're hearing from your constituents, insofar as some of the problems that we encountered early on and we may be still encountering now, access to Wi-Fi, computers, technical support to families, trying to navigate all these issues, even as parents are trying to go to work or working from home. What are you hearing from your constituents, sir? Are they, do they feel more confident this time around? Do they see that students have adjusted and they're, we all know students are very resilient, but I wonder what you're hearing from your constituents.
Yeah, students are incredibly resilient, and it even makes me think about my daughter the other day when we were going to go grab some ice cream, and I got out the car with my mask, and I took her out the car, and she didn't have her mask, and she put her hand over her nose, and I thought she sneezed, and I said, what's going on? She said, I don't want to get the germs on me. And it's amazing that our kids are like, wait, like they're living through COVID. So we had to go in the car and grab her mask and get her set up. And kids are resilient. They have always been resilient. And one of the things that I'm hearing from my constituents is really based on the district and the communication that they're receiving, and whether it's district or charter. So in situations in which there's a need of a sense of over communication, those parents, they feel a lot more comfortable in situations where they don't know a lot of information. They are uncertain. But what I've seen is school districts and superintendents and leaders really take a stand and say, look, we're going to make the decision that we're going to go to a hybrid model. We're going to go to an in-person model, and we're going to stick to this schedule, which provides some type of certainty, especially on a work schedule for someone who may not have the ability to work a satellite.
Thank you for that. Thank you for the anecdote about your daughter as well. That's quite funny. I can see that in my child. He's 9 years old. I brought him to Costco maybe 2 weeks ago, and he clung to me very tightly, and he was very conscious and cognizant about social distancing and making sure that he's not too near, very near people. It's amazing how our kids are adapting and kind of overcoming and learning that this is kind of the way we have to live for maybe quite a while. Let me ask Carla. Carla, I hear a lot about personalized learning as one of the strategies that maybe can help overcome some of these challenges that we're facing. I'm not really sure what that means and how you would apply it to maybe a very big school district or a very big classroom, for example. So to help us understand what is personalized learning and what that means on the ground?
That is a tough question, and probably the hardest one I get asked every day for the past 6 years nationally. But let me start by saying that what it is it will look different in every school and every community, and that's the way it should be, because it should reflect the needs of the community. Some of those programs, it's not a program, it's not something you're buying off the shelf, it's not a piece of technology, it's really a change in thinking. And it's really a shift away to more student-centered learning, as Amanda discussed, away from school-based learning. So if you think about it, personalized learning really, in essence, is special education done well for all kids. Sometimes I hesitate to say that because that sounds so daunting, but what that really is a recognition that every child is unique and different. But again, how that may manifest or look in a classroom should look different from school to school. But one of the things I've heard said, which took me a couple of years to really get, and you'll probably get this right away, that it's a shift from a focus on instruction to learning. And it took me a while to understand that. If you think about the decades of education debate, it's really been a focus on instruction. What are we going to instruct? Who's qualified to instruct it? It's really that personalized learning is really focused on what are they learning? What do we want them to learn? How will we know that they've learned it? And that's a really big shift in mindset.
I'm sorry, so what you're saying is that whereas before we focus on the credentials maybe of our teachers and very heavy focus on maybe the content of our curriculums, what you're seeing now, and correct me if I'm wrong, what you're seeing now is that suddenly because of COVID-19, it kind of opened this window in which we're really thinking about how our kids are learning and what they're learning. Am I getting you right?
Well, let me be really clear. This personalized learning is an evolution. It's an evolution from where, because curriculum and teacher qualifications are still critical. When we have decades of research that shows that the quality of the teacher and the curriculum matter. What this conversation is taking the next step to think about, how do we design our schools to meet the needs of kids? And that's what COVID has really made bare for everybody, is that one size fits all doesn't work. And simply digitizing what we've been doing for years is not working either.
So go ahead, ma'am.
Oh, and I was just going to jump in too, Luigi, and to expand the conversation with Carla around, I think it's important that our community understands that instructional loss since March 16th, when we closed schools, does not always equal learning loss. Our kids are learning. And as we welcome our children back into our schools, it is really important that we do not tackle learning loss as a deficit. Because if we tackle it as a deficit, we are going to perpetuate the inequities that have been very prevalent in the public education system for decades. So we have to think about the architecture of our standards. Our standards are built on learning progressions. So we know that kids learn a high priority standard that is critical for their success later into life. That particular standard builds from kindergarten to 12th grade. And so we have to understand how those skills and the complexity of the standard builds. And so we have to meet kids at the grade level and fill in gaps as they emerge, versus saying, let's take a look and say, oh, we have all of this loss, and we start designing backwards. Kids will never, ever, ever catch up. So we have to think about where are they and how do we move forward within the grade level standards? And that sounds like a daunting task, but sophisticated teams of teachers coming together to plan for learning is very different than planning for instruction. So if we plan for instruction, we talk about the strategies we use. When we plan for learning, we're talking about what is the evidence and the artifacts that kids are going to show us to tell us that they have learned. And it may not have been only in our classroom that they have learned. It could be in their life that they have learned. So this is a big shift for systematic thinking. This happens in individual classrooms, and with the work for the Center for the Future of Arizona and Knowledge Works, it's how do we expand this across the entire system to say, this is what kids need to know and learn, and this is how these are all the ways they can demonstrate that they have learned that is meaningful and relevant to them and the life that they want to own along the way.
So Amanda, Andi mentioned meeting kids where they're at. And can you make that a little bit concrete for me? What does that mean exactly in terms of a classroom setting, for example? How does that manifest?
Sure. So one of the ways that schools are doing this, or what it looks like, is this idea of learning pathways. So Andi, or Superintendent Fourlis, was talking about the standards and their progression. Really what schools and educators are doing is unpacking those standards and really looking at what are the knowledge and skills that students need to master in order to assure that they've really learned that. And then what schools are doing, what teachers are doing, is using assessment, using formative assessment to say, what do you know? As we've talked about, kids know things. They come to us. They have things that they know. And then where do they need to be, and make those learning targets very explicit. So in schools that I've had the opportunity to visit, you can go up to a child in kindergarten, 3rd grade, 8th grade, and they can articulate what I'm working on in my reading class, or what I'm working on in math, why I'm working on this, and where I am in this learning continuum. So educators might talk about that as, oh, a student is emerging, or they're developing, or they're demonstrating or applying. It's a progression of learning. But what's really important in this shift around this idea of personalization is that kids and their families also understand that. So it suddenly becomes very empowering. I know why I'm in my class, what I'm working towards, and what it will look like when I've mastered that. And I think what's important is these are not just ideas. These are skills and strategies that are evidence-based. They're proven to really help kids address gaps in learning that we can support educators and teachers to do right here in our state.
I want to ask Representative Bolding, when you're hearing all of these strategies, I wonder what you're thinking in terms of what the state is going to have to do to try and support the idea of maybe potential systemic changes and support the schools that are really trying to be innovative. I know you're not in special session. Some of the legislators have been clamoring for that, but I don't see that happening between now and the elections, and maybe not this year.
Yeah, so this is a great question, and I think it's important to uplift that, these conversations are already happening. Lawmakers are already getting together and talking to community, talking to agencies and saying, what should we do? And I think that there are a couple of things that we can begin to rethink, especially, the revision of seat time. What does that actually look like? And begin to critically think about what does seat time look like? Additional, professional development for our teachers in order to make sure that they have the knowledge and skills and competencies that they need to work in all environments. Training for not only our teachers, but our parents. The reality is that we have over 700 languages spoken at home throughout this state. And for many, we're asking our parents to be that frontline educator. And when we have, laws like English only, right, that will only allow you to receive content in particular ways, it can present itself as a barrier for that parent who's being that frontline educator. So we have to think about what that means. And, obviously, when we look at our standardized testing in A through F, we have to absolutely revisit that, especially when those benchmarks directly correlate to funding in a classroom. So, those are some of the places that we can start. But I think that list is one that can continue to expand. But thinking with the student mind first, absolutely seat time, absolutely thinking about the professional development for our teachers and our parents, and then rethinking what does it look like to really measure success for our students. It has to be much more than a standardized test.
So let me ask,
Can I add to that?
Yeah.
I have a wish list of what I want the legislature to tackle, and I'm just so grateful for Representative Bolding's partnership on this. So going into next legislative session, and we're still working on planning around this, of course, but One of the huge issues that will need to be tackled is when we're talking about having effective teaching and learning for our students, we absolutely need our teachers and our educators. And by that, when I say educators, that includes our school counselors, our social workers, our special education providers like speech pathologists, and school psychologists. There's a whole, our schools are such a critical place for those wraparound services to make sure that we're making sure that the children's needs are met, that their families' needs are met, so that they're ready to learn and have the ultimate success in learning. So going into next legislative session, the COVID-19 crisis has exacerbated our teacher shortage. We just saw that there was a report come out from ASPA that we're now at 28% of our teaching positions are vacant or filled by substitutes or emergency certified teachers. And in talking with some districts, they're even telling us that they have half the number of people willing to be emergency certified teachers. So even in places where they were really relying on emergency certified teachers, there's a shortage there as well, because they're often retired community members who are willing to step in, and now there's a higher risk for them to be in the classroom. So addressing that is going to be a huge priority. Last legislative session, there was a bill for $50 million for special education services that just didn't make it all the way through, but there was great bipartisan support around that. Also, our state has no investment in early education, preschool, full-day kindergarten, which is also going to be critical for thinking about getting our little ones in there to have the ultimate success possible. So I could go on and on, but wanted to point out that there's going to be significant needs in making sure that we're addressing the teacher and educator shortages and making sure that that we're addressing the whole system.
So before I go to Carla and then Andi, because I know you want to jump in, just real quick. Anecdotally, we're hearing that some teachers are really reluctant to go back to the classrooms at this point. I do wonder if you're tracking this one and what you're seeing in terms of maybe the number of teachers that have decided not to teach anymore as a result of their conclusion that there's too much at risk to be back in the classroom in person.
Yeah, I can speak referring to the report that ASPA put out, that when they did that survey back in January of this year, it was at about 21% of our teaching positions were vacant, and now we're at 28%. So I would attribute the majority of that to COVID circumstances, and it could be personal reasons, it could be medical reasons, it could be retirement. So we're still working on collecting that data, and ADE, the department, is moving towards having a better data tracking system to do this. So we're not just relying on the ASPA report, but at this time we don't have the technological infrastructure to track that.
Carla, go ahead, ma'am. I know you wanted to jump in.
I was just gonna comment on Representative Bolding's comments. They were spot on, of course. But the irony is these are the same policy issues that have really been standing in the way of personalized learning more broadly. So I wanted to just point out what's happening right now is that schools are recognizing the need to personalize learning, to meet students where they are. All these terms that we've been using for quite some time because it's just more obvious now. So we're really excited that the issues that we've been trying to spotlight for many years are just right out there. So I've gotten calls from many states in the past couple of weeks saying, what policy issues do we need to tackle? And generally my response is, look at the emergency orders, the FAQs, the waivers, all the things you've had to do the past 6 months. Those are the things that are standing in the way of innovation more broadly.
And Andi, go ahead, ma'am.
And I guess I'd just like to add on to that conversation. I think we, as a state and as school districts, we need to rethink our graduation requirements, because oftentimes there are inherent barriers for our kids to get across the finish line. And our workforce is depending upon high school graduates, so we need a meaningful diploma that represents the absolute most critical knowledge and skills that kids need in order to graduate. So a first step is rethinking a 4-year math graduation requirement that requires Algebra 2. That is a huge barrier for many of our children. And we need to be thinking about embedded credits and how can kids in a competency or a mastery-based model, how are kids earning in an English class, how are they also earning social studies credit, or vice versa, in a social studies credit class also earning English credit. Because when we think about interdisciplinary studies, we know that that's how the brain learns and makes sense of information. So our kids should be able to have the opportunity to earn credit in that same way.
And I think one of the things that Representative Boulding talked about is the idea of flexibility, right? And that's manifesting itself in terms of how do you actually deal with seat time. And I know there's a lot of policy conversations about modifying that. So we're actually, so our policy actually reflects the situation in the ground, the reality that we have now vis-a-vis the reality from the 1980s when we started doing all these. Amanda.
Really quick, Luigi,
Yeah,
can
go
I
ahead.
jump in there? So with that aspect is, you know, and the conversation around accountability as well, especially when you have this accountability conversation, whether it's for teachers, students, or schools, I think this gives us an opportunity to rethink what accountability looks like, in the sense of what does it mean to show up for your students, right? I mean, is it you know, making sure that there are school meals there, that there's outreach to parents. I mean, I've actually seen a lot more conversations between parents and teachers now than I've seen in a very long time, right? And like, what does that actually, how does that lead to, you know, even deeper sense of learning? So rethinking what accountability look like, not just in this sense of I'm gonna, like, you know, come into your classroom and evaluate you based on, you know, the lesson that you prepared for, and then like we're gonna look at the standardized testing, but like, what else does it mean to really be there for our student? Is something that I think we could really really critically think about.
So let me follow up on that one, because accountability is of course a major issue. You know, the standardized test they give us a baseline, right? They track whether, you know, from point A to point Z where the student is at. And in theory, then we can kind of provide whatever intervention is necessary to help that child do better, something like that. But I wonder, Kathy, just real quick, where are we in terms of standardized testing? What's the conversation for the spring? Are we actually going to do it?
I think that's still yet to be seen. There's quite a few factors that play. So currently there are both federal and state requirements that we have state testing, and there's no relief from that today. That could change. It could change by the end of this year. It could change in the spring, and we will continue to monitor that. But as of right now, because of the federal and state requirements, we are still moving ahead with planning for state testing. That said, I just want to also piggyback on what others were just saying about the accountability system, because we need to be clear that there's the purpose of the state test, of the assessment, is to collect data. And there's lots of different ways we can collect data. So there's the state assessment is one, to have a good apples to apples comparison across the whole state. But then there's also data like graduation rates or enrollment, or you know, looking at a different, there's lots of different indicators that our accountability system utilizes. And actually yesterday we had our State Board of Education meeting. And to be clear, I'm not speaking on behalf of the board, but we had a really good, robust conversation about data quality and looking at all the different indicators and starting to study which data points that our accountability system currently uses, which data points are going to, would we expect to have high quality data versus concerning data, especially particularly during this COVID time. And the board had a great conversation about, you know, maybe we need to be thinking about we plan to be having a lot more conversations about the accountability system. So by that, I mean the A through F grading system. So I just want to be clear that there's kind of a distinction there that I think the data collection piece and having high quality data is really important so that we know what the inequities are, but there's still going to need to be a lot of conversations with the legislature and our other state leaders to be thinking about what the accountability A through F system will look like in the future.
So let me ask Amanda. I'm sorry, go ahead. I think you were going to jump in.
Oh yeah, I would love to just to say that I think we haven't yet in this conversation articulated it quite this way, but what I think many of us are talking about is that in Arizona, we really need to have an articulated vision for what we want in our education system. A couple of us had a chance to talk earlier last week, and it was mentioned, you know, now is the time to have a conversation around what does our education system look like in light of the 21st century. I mean, you mentioned the 1980s. So much so much has changed since then, but you look at our education system and we have not yet really evolved it. Dr. Fourlis talked about that Mesa Public Schools has something called a portrait of a graduate. I think of that as a North Star. Where are we headed? What is it that we want for every single learner when they leave our K-12 system? We've not yet articulated that in Arizona. And I think having that conversation, including our business leaders, including our higher education leaders, including families, educators, to really talk about that, that then can provide the guidance under which we can have conversations around accountability, assessment, teacher credentials, learning pathways, graduation requirements. I do get worried when we start to talk about those things in isolation, because I think it continues to create more fractures as opposed to having a larger coherent system that's really about supporting the success of every child, ensuring that we're maximizing learning and that kids have the knowledge, skills to thrive and succeed in a rapidly changing world. And the last thing I'll say on that is I'm a mom of 2 kids. I want nothing more than for my kids to be able to thrive. I want them to be master learners. You know, those are the things that I hope we're really looking at incentivizing and prioritizing within our system for every child.
What is the portrait of a graduate? And I want to get to our audience questions, but I'm just curious. What is it? What is it exactly?
I'll take that one, Luigi. So in Mesa Public Schools, our portrait of a Mesa Public School graduate is focused on 3 essential attitudes. That when our children come into our system, that it is really important to our community that by the time that they graduate and throughout their educational career, that they are spending much of their time thinking about the essential attitudes of being ethical, of being inclusive, and being resilient. And this was all designed way before COVID. And those are those attitudes that we're relying upon every single day. Then we're looking at those essential skills of collaboration, communication, critical thinking, problem solving, being a community contributor. So as we design for instruction and as we design for learning, it is front of mind to say, how are we allowing children opportunities to solve big problems, to think innovatively and to think critically? And we're collecting evidence of that. What does that look like in preschool? What does that look like in 8th grade? What does it look like in 12th grade? Because those are the common conversations. And what happens is when you start to talk about the focus of a school system around a portrait of a graduate, that is a beautiful entry point to build collaborative systems throughout the community. So that's where the workforce comes in and says, I get that. I get what it means to be a collaborator and a communicator. I'm not sure I get this thing with you guys and your academic standards and how you have progressions and learning targets and all of that. Leave that to the educators. But the workforce, we can jump in and be your partner. Our municipalities can jump in and say, let's be your partner. Our informal learning institutions, our nonprofits can jump in and say, we've got that. That makes sense. So when we can start to bring a conversation together around what is critically important as creating a better community through essential attitudes and essential skills, we can bring resources together to solve a complex problem of what kids should be learning and how they should be experiencing learning in a school system.
So thank you for that, Superintendent. I want to ask a couple of the questions that we're getting from our audience. I think this one's directed to Superintendent Hoffman. Is a strategy being addressed for what happens when a vaccine is made available? Are there going to be rules in place that only students who have been vaccinated will be able to attend school?
I think that's actually more of a question for the Department of Health Services. We've been partnering closely with them as well as with our county health directors, but in terms of vaccination distribution and policies, that would be better left to our epidemiologists to respond to.
I think this is a question for Andi. Are you meeting a lot of resistance from parents regarding making the children's social distance, wear masks, etc.? And if yes, how are you handling it?
Great question, and it's certainly top of mind. While I love the topic of learning loss, I have to admit to all of you, I've been spending a lot more time on mitigation strategies and trying to be an epidemiologist. So I've made good friends in the epidemiology way so they can help to guide us. Physical distancing is a challenge. When you put kids together in a building, physical distancing is a challenge. So that is why it is so important that we have a very strict, and I think one of the words was strict, we have very strict protocols and expectations around wearing of masks. It is not an option. We do know that there are some children that have some accommodations that we need to work through to provide them a comfortable place and space for them to be able to wear a mask. For some children, coming to in-person learning is not going to be successful because we will not be able to fulfill the accommodation. So that accommodation is continuing in remote learning. All of our children have mask breaks. We're teaching mask breaks outside in a physically distanced way. As adults, I need a mask break. So that is important, but we're teaching how to do it. And we cannot let up on our high expectation of appropriate mask wearing. It is what will keep us in school. And I just want to do a quick plug to say those public health benchmarks open up our schools. But what is going to keep our schools open is diligent behavior of safety to keep them open. And it's really important that we adhere to masks.
So here's a question for Carla. What aspects of our current work would you suggest schools strive to retain to help accelerate a push toward a personalized learning approach to instruction? And that is when we return to in-person setting at our schools.
Can you repeat that first part, please?
I think if I'm understanding this question, it's asking about what, how should schools look at our workforce, and how should they then frame their, their program to ensure that, what we're graduating really is, they're able to fill a workforce, but also we're personalizing it toward, that whole approach, which is that we have the skilled workforce to then make sure that our economy thrives. I think that's the question, essentially.
I think just ask your local workforce. Superintendent Fourlis alluded to it. I know the Mesa School District has a really close connection with their business community. The handful of states that have started to build profile of the graduates, and that term is a term of art. It can look and be called many different things, but basically a statewide vision for what we want our graduates to be able to know and do. Started with higher education and the business community, because those are the two recipients of our graduates. So their buy-in, their seats at the table at the creation of these is absolutely critical.
Here's a question. Here's a question from Cindy, and she's wondering about family engagement issues and support for school staff. What issues concerns are you hearing in terms of family engagement issues and then support for school staffers? I guess that's a question for. Yep, go ahead, ma'am.
I'll take that one. So you talked about innovation, and what are some of the innovations that are happening during COVID? And something I'm really excited to talk about that has happened in Mesa Public Schools is every one of our schools has designed a family support network. And that is intentional outreach in the world of technology, social services, as well as academic support. So that we have a big red, and literally the big red help button on every website for every school that says, I need help. Click, and you fill out a quick form, and then you said, I need help, and it goes to the Family Support Network. And they're doing whatever they can to align the resources. Schools are complicated. They are hard to navigate. So when the minute that we hear that there's a problem, we send out a family support network, not only information coming in, but when we have kids that are unengaged, that they're not logging in a remote environment, they are reaching out. So it's a two-way conversation. And that is something that will stick with Mesa Public Schools for the rest of my time here, because it is so critically important.
So I think we only have room for one more question, but here's a question from Wendy. Children with special needs are having a hard time in learning and adapting to the new learning or virtual learning environment where kids, if kids don't have long-term, let me reread this one. Children with special needs are having a hard time on learning and adapting to a new virtual learning environment. What about them? What are you seeing in terms of our ability to help them?
I'm gonna take that one.
And I can start it, and then you can help me if you'd like.
Excellent.
I think.
And then I'll go in the mom view.
Oh yeah, and Carla too. I would just say that in terms of meeting the needs of our students with disabilities, that I strongly believe those decisions need to be made at the individual child level, that because each child has such unique needs. And so I've heard some really innovative, creative ways to be serving our students with disabilities who have IEPs and receive special education services. When we implemented the last executive order that that mandated the on-site support services. We provided a ton of guidance out to schools on how to make sure that they were providing special education services for those who wanted that on-site support, who just to make sure they had access. That was so important to us, because providing those types of services, you think about, for example, physical therapy or occupational therapy, that's really challenging to do virtually. So we wanted to make sure that we had flexible policies that could accommodate that. But our special education team, the ESS team in ADE, has been doing tons of webinars and guidance to make sure that our special education directors and special education staff have resources and guidance. But I do want to acknowledge this has not been easy, and it's a very challenging needle to thread. But would love to hear more from what Carla's experience has been as well.
Go, Carla.
Personally, I tell you, my daughter's charter school has done a phenomenal job, so I won't even go there. I wanted to say that I have a seventh grade daughter with special needs. The National Down Syndrome Society has, or is it the Down Syndrome Council, has this great one-liner that I love: more alike than different. So when I think about even that question, it applies. The issues that our students with disabilities are facing in this remote environment are exactly the same as all students. They may be exacerbated. And of course, they're different by disability. There are some kids with disabilities that are thriving on an online environment. So it's more alike than different, but they're just more exacerbated. And especially when I think about the social emotional piece. I mean, for parents like me who've been fighting for inclusion for so long, it's because we know that our kids need to be with their typically developing peers, to be challenged, to be learning, increasing their communication skills, speech therapy. And that's the piece that's missing really for all kids. And with kids with disabilities, we have to just keep trying to be even more innovative to meet those needs. And I do appreciate the executive order that really provided some on-site services for our kids as well.
And Andy, just real quick, I know you wanted to add something, but I think we're pretty much out of time.
No, I'm good.
You're good.
No,
Okay, perfect. Perfect. So again, to our panelists, Carla, Representative Boulding, Superintendent Hoffman, Superintendent Fourlis, Dr. Burke, thank you for joining us and taking the time to explain and answer these questions. I want to thank again the Center for the Future of Arizona for sponsoring this morning's morning scoop. Without the center's support, we cannot engage and have a platform to discuss issues such as the one that we're discussing this morning. So thank you all to our audience and to our viewers and our listeners. Thank you for sticking with us for 1 hour, and please enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you very much.
All.
Thank you,
Thank
Luigi.
you.
Have a good one.
Have
Bye
a
for
good day.
now.
Bye-bye.